Welcome, everyone. Hi, I'm Andrea Sato. I'm with the Wilton Library. I work on programs, adult programs, and we're glad to see you here this morning. So just wanted to say a quick welcome and say how much we appreciate partnership with SPEDNet and the Wilton Public Schools for programs like these. I know how important they are to parents and to family members. So I hope you'll get a lot out of this, and I hope you'll come back for other programs at the library. So with that, I'll turn it over to Janine.
Thank you, Andrea. Hello, I'm Janine Kelly, and Carolina Corrigan and I are the co-presidents of SPEDNet. We're so happy to have you guys here today for this in-person presentation. It's been a long time, so it's good to see smiling faces. This is our last presentation for the season, and so we're very happy to have you here. We are grateful for our co-sponsors. Thank you so much, Andrea and the Wilton Library, and also to the Wilton Public Schools. Just for your own information, this presentation is being recorded and will be available as a webinar probably later tonight for any of you who have friends that maybe didn't get a chance to see it. Also, just for your own purposes, be careful when you ask questions because we can't guarantee confidentiality. It is being recorded. So we're so happy to have James Cooney here with us today. He's going to talk about qEEG and neurofeedback, breakthrough applications in neuroscience that lead to improved diagnoses and treatment of emotional, behavioral, and learning issues. Mr. Cooney holds a Master's of Social Work degree from Fordham University's Graduate School of Social Service and is a licensed clinical social worker with over 35 years of experience in the treatment of addictive disorders, as well as treatment of developmental trauma, anxiety, and depressive disorders, ADHD, learning disabilities, and anger management in adolescents and adults. He has been working in the field of neurofeedback for over 20 years. He has served as a member of the executive board of the Northeast Regional Biofeedback Society and chaired its education committee. He is an active member of the Association for Applied Psychophysiology and Biofeedback and the International Society for Neurofeedback and Research. His current research interests include the use of neurofeedback in the school setting to assist struggling learners and in assisting successful recovery for individuals with substance use disorders. Just a few housekeeping issues. Please check out our website at www.spednetwilton.org. We have on there so many different resources for you, past webinars, helpful information, and also our guide, Bringing Knowledge to the Table, How to be an Effective Advocate for Your Child, which breaks down the whole special education process in very user-friendly terms. Also, if you find our support helpful, please feel free to donate. We are a nonprofit organization, and 100% of our proceeds go directly back to you and the community. Also, I think we're going to be leaving questions until the end, and that's a good reminder if you could just silence your phones. That would be great. I know we all have trouble with that. I have to remember to silence mine too. So be sure to ask your questions at the end of the presentation. And also, in an effort to go green, we are not providing handouts, but you will be able to find everything from this presentation on our website along with the recording of this presentation. So with that being said, welcome, Mr. Cooney. I will turn the presentation over to him.
Good morning. As said, I'm a clinical social worker. I retired last June from a public school system, local public school system. So I spent 20 years in public schools, as well as some of the other things that I've done. Before I get started, I need a volunteer. Okay, I ran this presentation past my wife, and she said, "You're too geeky." Okay, so I need somebody on Geek Watch. Anybody volunteer for that? Please? Okay, okay. So if it starts to drift into geekiness, okay, let me know, and I'll tone it back a little bit, okay?
Do we have a signal?
Yeah, just wave, okay, or you know, whatever. Because the subject I'm talking about is pretty geeky. I first discovered neurofeedback about 24 years ago now. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And I've watched it evolve. It was kind of lonely 24 years ago when I was, first hearing about it. There were, just people who were out there who were looking at this. And I've seen it evolve, and as I said, I'll talk a little bit more about that history. So to get started, I want to talk about a couple of terms, okay, just to clarify some terms. The first one that I'll be talking a lot about is arousal, okay? So that wife I spoke about, who warned me about my geekiness, knows that it's really important not to tell me anything that is important as I'm getting up from bed and getting ready for the morning. I'm off to the shower. Because although I'm moving, okay, I'm not awake yet, all right? And anything important, I'm not going to remember. So I'm walking around, but I'm still asleep. So I've got a low level of arousal. I'm mobile, but not alert. Someplace in the shower, get my power in the shower, I wake up and, I hit alive and kicking, okay? My arousal level tends to be a little high, a little on the anxious end of things, but we have a range of emotion that we go through over the day, which is our alertness, okay? And then some of us have an arousal pattern that it's 3 o'clock in the morning, you're walking down a dark alley, and you hear footsteps behind you, all right? That's a heightened level of arousal, okay? Lots of folks live there, all right? And for kids who live there, it's really hard to learn because all of the resources of the brain are going out of the cortex, which you need for learning, and into the limbic system, which is where you're emotionally responding, okay? We will talk some more about that with water falling. So another thing we're going to be talking about is the autonomic nervous system, okay? And that's the nervous system that kind of keeps us going and doesn't require any conscious, we can become conscious of what it's doing, but it's the operation that keeps us running, okay? And it has two branches. The sympathetic nervous system, that's our salience. We're looking at the environment, both internal, what's going on inside my body, and what's going on outside of my body. And it's constantly monitoring that, and it's the fight or flight response. So we're monitoring both environments, inner and outer, for threat, okay? And responding to that. When it activates, we get an increase of cortisol, adrenaline. Now, adrenaline does two things. It's a vasoconstrictor, so it constricts your veins, okay, and arteries. And it's an accelerant, so your heart rate goes up. So you have more blood going through narrow channels, blood pressure goes up, okay? So it's an activation, your entire body gears up to run or fight. Lots of people live there. They're in that level of arousal, okay? Its balancing is the parasympathetic nervous system. That's where we repair, rest and repair, all right? When we monitor a heartbeat, okay, an inhale increases your heart rate. An exhale decreases the heart rate. So and I'll talk about one of the forms of biofeedback is actually monitoring the variability between heartbeats, beat to beat variability, okay? And that's a good reflection of this autonomic nervous system. So, another term that we're going to be talking about, so the easiest way to remember that is brake and gas, okay? Gas pedal is the sympathetic, the brakes are the parasympathetic. So, being okay. We're looking at, we get slapped on the butt and welcome to the world, okay? And we have a problem. We're trying to maintain okayness. Right? We have one strategy, we scream when we're not okay and try and get you to do something to fix whatever's wrong. We don't have language yet, we can't tell you what's wrong. And as parents, we have to figure out, we go through the checklist. Wet, gas, what else? Wet, gas, warm, cold, hungry, okay? We try all of those and the kid's still screaming, right? Been there? Walking around and trying to find something to get this kid to okay, all right? Now, okay is just Not too elevated, not too lethargic. We like lethargic at that point because we've been up all night holding a screaming kid, but the back and forth, and that's our struggle in life. We're always constantly coming up with ways to get back to being okay. We don't like not being okay. And not okay is usually an elevated level of energy in our body, okay? So high arousal has two faces, okay? One can be motivation, I'm energized and ready to go, and the other is I'm anxious. Both are high arousal states, okay? Low arousal can be depressed, lethargic, or calm, contented, okay? So the arousal pattern is part of it, but it's also what the stories we tell ourselves about this condition. If I'm on a roller coaster, I like roller coasters, so we go tick, 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 we go over the side, and I'm like this, going through the whole ride. I like that, that's exciting, it's stimulating, all right? If I'm on 95 and I hit a patch of ice and my car starts spinning, I'm like that, I don't like that. I don't like that. Because I have the illusion of control on the roller coaster. Nothing bad probably won't happen. It might. Okay, that little element of danger can be exciting and stimulating. Okay, but not spinning on the ice on 95. So what we're always working to do, one of the things we developed as a species is the ability to think as a way of managing okayness. All right, and we developed the ability to plan. Yesterday when I walked down that path, something awful happened. I can remember that. And I can think, maybe that might happen again today. Maybe I need to take a different path. And so we evolved elaborate abilities for abstract thought. But that was in the service of maintaining okayness. Okay, that's a central thing that we deal with all of our life. Okay, and we deal with it all day. Trying to get back to this upper quadrant up here. No? Okay. The right, your right upper quadrant. That's where we want to hang out. Certainly on the right side of that circle. Okay. And the last term that will come up is neuroplasticity, okay, which has become a buzzword. Everything's about neuroplasticity. But basically, it's the brain's ability to learn. And learning requires alteration of the connections of the neurons in the brain, okay? And our brain remains plastic, it remains changeable, able to learn throughout a lifetime. What this is looking at is a graph of the covariance of looking at, age-related ability to learn and effort required, okay? When we're young, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, has enormous ability to learn because that's what it's doing. We're making all new connections. And it requires very little effort. It's play is usually what produces these neuro changes. As we go along, around age 30, it starts to require a lot more effort. Right on through till 70, 80, 90. We continue to be able to change our brains, but it takes a lot more effort as we go along, okay? So one of the ways we do that is with something called feedback. That's how we learn, okay? And feedback is merely the reflection back to a system, an organization, or in this case, a person, what's going on around them. When I'm driving my car, I can figure out how fast I'm going by looking at the trees going by, the telephone poles, the sensation of the car. You know, if anyone drive a standard transmission? Anyone left who knows how to do that? Okay, so once you know how to drive a standard transmission, you can get into any car with a standard transmission and drive it, but you have to learn one new thing in each car you get in. What is that? The clutch. Where does the clutch engage? Okay, and that's a felt thing, and you need to learn that feeling with each car you get in. Once you have it, you're driving fine. And it usually comes quickly if you've been driving lots of standard cars. But without that, you're doing a lot of chugging, all right? Probably, if you don't do that until your 90s, it's going to take you longer to do that than if you'd learned it at 16, okay? So that feedback is the feel of the clutch, where it engages. That's a sensory-based feedback. All right? Certainly the trees going by is also a sensory. You know, it's a visual thing. All right? So it really helps to have a speedometer, which is a gauge that tells me exactly how fast I'm going. All right? So the manner of the feedback really matters, and how accurate that feedback is helps with the learning process. All right? So it's really important to have accurate feedback. Okay? This looks at how men and women see themselves in the mirror. Okay? Depending on the mirror, is it accurate feedback? So biofeedback is measurement of bodily activity that can be then reflected back to you. Right now, your heart is beating at a particular rate. Mine's a little high at the moment. We're waiting for it to come down. It will, okay? But that's something we could put a monitor, I could put a monitor on and know exactly what rate my heart is beating, okay? I can look at the electrical activity of my muscles. If I've got an injury, okay, I can put sensors on and I can train that. All right? So all it is really just monitoring something that we're normally not aware of and giving us an indicator of what that is. In this case, we have sensors on this person's body, head, chin, chest, arms, fingers. Depending on what we're measuring, we place it on different areas of the body. And we measure that activity, usually the electrical activity of the body. Run that through a computer, and then display that activity in a way that makes sense to that person. Okay, usually a game, okay, or other kind of things like that. So we basically put a speedometer on your body, and you learn how to change speed, alter speed. You can become conscious and controlling something that's happening usually unconsciously and out of control. So if it can be measured in the body, it can be trained. Some of those ways are EMG, as I've spoken about. That's usually for athletics and, you know, optimum performance or repair. Okay, and that's literally looking at the electrical activity, nerve to muscle. And, you know, sometimes we can get spasms and things like this, and it will be used to release those spasms. Hand warming, that was one of the original anxiety treatments that came out of biofeedback. Basically, what you do is you hold a sensor in your hand, and it measures the temperature of your skin. All right? And we would teach people, they would teach themselves, they would learn how to increase the temperature of their hand. Now, why would we do that? Well, when you're anxious, when you're in that high arousal, your blood flow changes in your body. The blood flow is reduced to the extremities, hands and feet, for mission critical, heart, lung, brain, heart, lung, brain. And so when there's less blood flow to your hands, the temperature drops. Increased blood flow to your hands, temperature goes up. So it's an indicator of where you are on that arousal. And if you actually learn how to increase the temperature of your hand, there's only one way to do that. Relax. And so it was teaching someone how to shift out of that high arousal, who was stuck there, down to a lower arousal rate with a gauge. This is heart rate variability. I mentioned that. Okay, that we monitor the beat-to-beat activity of your heart rate. And then we teach you to breathe in a resonant way, kind of a 5-count breathing. Lots of people say, breathe, breathe. This, I can, you know, hook up you to this and show you what happens to your heart rate when you breathe differently. It changes. Okay, it's a very effective tool for lowering arousal. And then we come to neurofeedback. Okay, that's what it looks like. There's a cap and wires. Okay. So neurofeedback is a form of biofeedback where what we're measuring and recording is the electrical activity of your brain, all right? And reflecting that back to you, much the same as all those other devices of various other parts of what your body does. So be on guard. We're getting into geekiness, okay? So basically, the way the brain works, it's an electrochemical action that's going on. You have billions of neurons, which are nerve cells, that are interleaved in this big ball of fat called a brain. They don't actually connect. Electrical signals go down these long strands and come to the juncture called the synapse. Okay? At the synapse, this charge is called an action potential. It causes one of the neurons to squirt chemicals across the synapse, the gap. All right? Those are called neurotransmitters. All right? So we go zit, squirt, zit, squirt. That's how our brain works. While you're sitting here listening to me, processing what I'm saying, there's a lot of zit squirting going on. And if you're not listening to me and daydreaming, there's still a lot of zit squirting going on too, okay? Because that's how your heart keeps beating, that's how you keep breathing. If you had breakfast right before you got there, the digestion, all of that is zit squirt, zit squirt, zit squirt, okay? That's the fundamental of what we're doing, okay? We'll keep going on that, I guess. There we go. So this particular slide is, the pharmaceutical company has done a really good job of educating us about what happens in the synapse, okay? The concept of a chemical imbalance. That came out in the 1960s, okay, is when it first started. They noticed that people who had depression seemed to improve when you raise serotonin levels in their brain. People with schizophrenia seem to improve when you lower dopamine in the brain. So they concluded that depression must be caused by a lack of serotonin, or not enough serotonin, and schizophrenia by too much dopamine. And so they developed lots of different drugs that did that, and they had some positive effects. However, extensive research went to look at the underlying premise of this, and they could not find determining evidence that too much dopamine was what caused schizophrenia, or not enough serotonin. There were lots of people who were depressed who had plenty of serotonin. And, so that's why medications are always sitting here like this. But the idea of a chemical imbalance has been well sold. We still adhere to that, okay? Although research as of, 2000, I think it was 2005. Yes. Kenneth Kendler, co-editor and chief psychological medicine, summed up the research findings in a succinct way. Have hunted for the big, simple neurochemical explanations for psychiatric disorders, and we haven't found them. Okay? But we all know that it's a chemical imbalance. Okay? Neurofeedback was started with a guy named Barry Sturman, his research. He was a researcher at, well, actually it wasn't. It was Joe Kamaya and a few other people. And this is where late 60s, 67, 68, somewhere around there. And it was people who were out on the frontiers of consciousness, Eslian and, deprivation tanks and psychedelics and all of these people who were out on the fringes of looking at different states of consciousness, found that you could increase alpha waves by training, okay, by monitoring them, and you could turn a red light or a green light, a red light, a green light, which would indicate when you were producing more alpha waves. And they found that you could, and alpha waves are associated with, meditators are very familiar with that, okay? It's one of the waves that comes up when you meditate. Your alpha waves increase. We'll talk a little bit more about that as I go along. But it also got associated with all those folks, okay? So, Tim Leary's talking about this? We don't want to know anything about that, it was kind of thing. But there was this researcher, Barry Sturman, who's a legitimate researcher, UCLA-based, and he was working with cats, and he was looking at operant conditioning. Are you familiar with Pavlov and his puppies? Ring the bell, feed the dog, they drool, okay? So he was doing similar research and seeing if he could train cats first to press a bar to get some cream and chicken stock. And he found that they would learn how to press the bar, and then he said, could I train them to a tone? And yes, they would figure out that when the tone was there, the lever would work. And what he was training for, he began to train for maintaining what he called a sensory motor rhythm, because he observed their brain activity, the electrical activity of their brain, while they were waiting for the tone. And it was a very calm but focused alertness while they waited, and then they'd respond quickly when they heard the tone. And he wanted to see if he could increase that. And he found that he could by extending the time between tones and all of that. And it was just, basic kind of research, behavioral research. Wrote up the papers, published them, and moved on. And he got a contract from NASA, who they were concerned because they were pretty sure that some of the components of the rocket fuel was affecting the mental status of the astronauts when they were sitting in the capsule. They were getting a little loopy. And so he did some work to try and isolate what the chemical was. It was a benzene compound that was in the fuel. And he did that because his lab used cats. I meant that horrible thing that the cat was in. It was, but anyway, so he used his cats, and exposed them to this toxin. And he found that, at a certain level, it would induce seizure, And then he's going, and then he's reviewing his data, and there were these 10 cats that weren't seizing like all the other cats. He said, well, what's going on with my data here? And he found that those 10 cats had been in his previous experiment of increasing this, what he called a sensory motor rhythm, that poised alertness, which seemed to be a regulating frequency in the brain. And so he looked at it and, said, did I somehow inoculate these cats or raise their seizure threshold? And he found that he had. Now, he also happened to have a lab assistant who had treatment-resistant epilepsy. She wasn't responding to medication. She was seizing. She had just had an accident, lost her driver's license because she had a seizure while driving. And, she's working on this thing with the cats, and she said, can we try me? And they said, sure, why not? Let's try it. And so they put the sensors on her head and began to train up this SMR, this sensory motor rhythm, in her head. And she responded. She had a significant reduction in the frequency of her seizures and the severity. This got his attention. So he developed a research protocol and went to NIH and said, can I have some money? This is very interesting stuff. And so they granted his first round of funding, which were 4 different studies looking at, what were going to be the large research studies protocols, and safety kind of things. And in all of those studies, he showed similar results, either the elimination of seizure or the significant reduction in frequency and severity. So he is gung-ho, and he goes back to NIH for the second round of funding for the big study, the double blind and, with big numbers. And NIH at that point said, I'm sorry, we're no longer funding behavioral research, we're just funding pharmaceutical research. And this was in 1970. The big study never got done. So all those 4 studies got published and sat out there. And the whole topic was associated with all those cosmic cowboys, for lack of a better term, the consciousness warriors, whatever. And so no legitimate researcher was going near it. But people who knew Barry Sternum and knew this woman, a woman named Margaret Ayers, who was associated with the lab, began just putting discs on people's heads and trying to help them, in various ways. And she happened to meet someone named the Othmers, who had a son, all right? Now, we're talking about the 70s. We were talking about before we got started today. I graduated from high school in 1973, which was the first year IDEA was passed. Prior to that, there were 2 diagnoses in a school: good kid, bad kid. Let them stay or get them out. That was the diagnosis, the level of diagnosis in schools. And they had a bad kid. But, or a kid that, now would be kind of a head scratcher, kind of on the spectrum somewhere, but we're not sure what that is, because he doesn't fit any of the current categories we have, but, not quite sure what to call it, And they met Margaret Ayers, and she trained their son, and he improved remarkably, And they got very interested because Mr. Othmer was Dr. Othmer, who was a PhD in electrical engineering, and Susan Othmer, who was a psychotherapist. And so they got very interested in this. And they began, they developed software, started a company to develop that software, and began putting discs on people's heads and beginning to figure out what this was all about, okay? They trained a whole bunch of people, okay, that particular company. And it was all clinicians who were kind of intrigued, okay? In 1994, I was setting up an intensive outpatient program in Norwalk Hospital for chemical dependency because the insurance companies had come in, managed care, and they weren't going to pay for the country club rehabs anymore because no research had been done that going away 28 days was any better than staying home. Okay, it's not that that's true, it's just the research had never been done, the money was flowing, there was no sense to prove it, and suddenly, when there was a sense to prove it, there was no proof. So everybody was scrambling to develop intensive outpatient programs because that would be funded. So I went out to the literature, is anybody doing anything new in addiction treatment? And I found these 3 studies that were doing traditional addiction treatment, nothing particularly different, except they were adding this thing called neurofeedback. And so I pulled the studies, and they were claiming an 80% abstinence rate at the 1-year mark. So in addiction studies, if you have a 20% abstinence rate in 1 year, you've had a great program. And so I was saying 80%, that's ridiculous. So I pulled it to just see what this is all about. 2 of the studies were, not great studies, but one of them was a really tight little study that was really interesting. It was done in VA hospital in Washington State. And they claimed a 72% abstinence rate at the 1-year mark. And this is with street-level Vietnam vet alcoholics who've been living on the street. Okay, these are the hardest folks to get to help. Okay, and they had an 80% abstinence, 79% abstinence rate at the 1-year mark. Now they hadn't had any relapse at that time, but they were still involved in treatment and abstinent at the 1-year mark, which is dramatically different. And so I was intrigued, all right, but there wasn't anybody around doing this, and so we set up the program. But I kept an ear out and an eye out for this because I was really interested in it. About 2 years later, the Othmer's company came to Greenwich and did a training. So I had to go. I went down to do that. So you spend, for me as a social worker, I'm dealing with neuroscience here, real geek stuff, okay? And this is like big learning curve for me. But the first 3 days are looking at the history, the science, and what that's all about. And the final 2 days, how to diagnose a problem and how to address it. And you use yourself as patient 0. And so I was having trouble with insomnia. It was called maintenance insomnia. I'd fall asleep after 4 hours, I'd wake up, okay, and be up for a couple hours and then fall asleep again and go back. I've actually seen a reference that in the 18th century literature, there's a common occurrence in fiction about first sleep, second sleep, okay, and that's a natural sleep pattern, okay, but for 21st century America, this doesn't work, okay, I need a full night's sleep. But anyway, so that was one of the things that I was targeting, in mind, because we divide the world at that point in time strictly around an arousal model. And problems that people came to you with were problems of over-arousal, under-arousal, or instability of arousal, okay, between those 2 states. And so anxiety, that's an over-arousal issue. Alert, you're elevated in that arousal. It's 3 a.m. and the footsteps in the dark alley. Depression, under-arousal, lethargy, there's no energy. Okay. ADHD, where do you think that falls? Under-arousal, over-arousal? Both, right. It's both, okay. But at the time, it was over. That's what we looked at until we looked at the brain, okay, and found out that for traditional, classic ADHD, it's a problem of under-arousal. And the hyperactivity is a learned behavior to address this drifting off into daydream. All right? And if I can be constantly stimulated, I can stay out of that sleepy, lethargic kind of state. And that's why folks who have that particular brain activity respond really well to stimulant drugs. Because if we give you a stimulant and you have a sleepy brain, you wake up. I had a cup of coffee this morning, just to push me a little to the edges of my high arousal kind of state. But any one of us, a little bit of stimulant will improve our performance. But if I happen to live at 3 a.m. and I have a cup of caffeinated coffee, I'm racing and uncomfortable. Okay? But if I have a sleepy brain, it improves. So anyway, Barry started this, and we moved on. So this is a history of publications on neurofeedback. Okay, I just did a Google search, Google Scholar search, and looked at each year, each band of years publication. I got in around 1995. 94 is when I first read it. There were 600 published studies, okay? I found those 3 that were related to the topic I was looking for. All right, I trained in 95, and I was in Fairfield County. There was one other person up around Hartford who had also done the training, and then there was somebody who I trained with who was down in White Plains, and that was it. And I was, really leery of this. So one other thing, in the training, okay, so that 4th day working myself up, I'm sorry, I forgot that. You would figure out what you were going to do, how you were going to train, you hand that to your partner, they would train you, and you would train them based upon their diagnosis of themselves and what they wanted to address. So I handed my partner my plan. She trained me like that, and I left Greenwich and was driving back up to my home in Norwalk at the time. And as I passed through Stamford, I'm going, ooh, I've got that too much coffee kind of jangly feeling, and I'm not comfortable. And I got home, and I'm really racy, okay? And I'm pacing, and I can't settle down. I'm not comfortable at all. Pacing up and down, I got about an hour and a half sleep that night. Couldn't sleep. It was up, and essentially I was manic. My energy level could be described as manic. All right? So I went back the next morning for the final day of training and said, okay, you answered question number 1. This does something. Can we fix it? Because I don't like where I am right now. And so rather than gratifying immediately, we had to, what'd you do? Why'd you do it? All that kind of stuff. And I'm just going, can we get past this and just fix it? And so he said, okay, well, you probably got a little aggressive in what you were doing. I understand that your thinking was right, but you probably got a little ambitious. And 3 minutes of training in the opposite direction, I felt that melt out of my body. And I just felt myself calm down, and I went, okay, this does do something, and I need to be really careful because I don't want to do to somebody else what I just did to myself, okay? And so that made me very cautious. So I bought a system, okay, and I began slowly playing with my own head, and then, my kids and anybody who would be willing to let me play around as I learned and continued training and all of those kind of things. And it was probably, 1988, 1999. I don't think linear. I've always wanted a photorealistic mind, and I have to settle for Jackson Pollock. I apologize. But wherever it was in there, I had my first patient where I said, do you want to try this? And this was someone who had a longstanding issues throughout his life. He was 21 years old, came to me with panic attacks. He had graduated from college, was in his first job, and couldn't stay in the office, would have to run out to his car in the parking lot with panic anxiety. His history was, he had surgery, back surgery, when he was about 3.5 and spent about almost 2 months in traction in a hospital, and then came out. His family was an alcoholic family, lots of disruption in the house. He had, problems in school with tension and focus, and had been tried on stimulants, had been tried. By the time he got to high school, he was having migraines and lots of problems, and had tried every neuroleptic, every medication known to man, and nothing was helping him. And so finally he said, forget the medicine, I'll do it without it, because it was always making things worse rather than better for him. And he managed to, get through college. He had never had any intimate relationships with anyone. When I'd seen him, he was, he was really a troubled kid. So we tried it, and we developed a protocol, and I started training him, and we had a checklist of kind of individual symptoms that we were doing. As I'm going down the list about session 9, on a scale of 1 to 10, do you see any improvement? And he's going 10, 10, 10, and really? I was surprised. And he says, yeah, I've never felt this good in my life. And we did 25 sessions, and we ended treatment. About 5 years later, he came back. He was in a management training program in the industry that he was working in, was in his final semester of his MBA, was getting married that June, and his father, his alcoholic father, had moved in with him, who was on his last legs and was dying, and he was caring for his dying father. And he was having a little more trouble with anxiety again, and I just said, if you weren't, I'd be worried about you with all of that going on, And we tried a little bit more, and I wasn't really able to help him, and he opted for some medication. Medication helped, finished the program, okay? But still we'll speak about his experience with neurofeedback as being dramatically transformative in his life, okay? He was my convincer. I said, okay, I've got something that's very powerful. And I can't tell you that everyone I've seen has had those kind of results, but lots of people have, and that's what really sold me, okay? And with the tools I have now, I would love to get another shot at him coming back, because I think possibly I could have helped him there as well, okay? But the medication helped, and that's fine too, okay? It's about functioning. It's not about, how we do it. It's getting you to a place that works for you, okay? So anyways, as you can see, there's been an explosion of research into this topic since about 2010, okay? It's gotten into the legitimate research. This is a whole approach that grew from clinicians up and got the researchers interested in it, okay? And the problem with it is most of the resistance was because it was these people who had software to sell were doing the research. And so it was biased research because somebody had something to sell. Okay, but these research, the companies that produced were parents, okay, were clinicians who had kids that weren't responding to anything else and had found something that was working, and that's where it was coming from. So a lot of the discussion about the research is, it's there, okay, but finally the research is being done, okay, and there's some interesting things coming out with legitimate research, okay. There are some problems with researching a behavioral treatment, okay. Triple blinding is very hard to do, all right, because if I'm sitting in a chair looking at my Aegg and I go like this and nothing happens to that tracing, all right, I know right away that that's not mine that I'm looking at, so it's hard to keep a blind, okay, when there's immediate feedback. But anyways, so with neurofeedback, what we do is we look at the frequency of the electrical activity. That's the first thing we look at, okay, and this is another place for Geek Watch, okay, so let me know. So we do 0 to 4, okay, hertz, microhertz is what it is we call it delta, okay? That's the predominant brainwave of an infant, and they tend to sleep most of the day, okay? And it's the predominant wave in our brain when we sleep, okay? When we close our eyes, it comes up. Just closing our eyes, it causes an increase in delta. Theta, okay? Theta is an integrative, it's kind of an inward focus. When you have a daydream, okay, anybody have a daydream? Okay, so the experience of a daydream is you're intently focused on something inside you. You're noodling on something. It's a creative place, a synthesizing place, but it's internally focused. Okay, you're aware of stuff going on around you, but you're not attending to it. You're attending to something internally. It's an internal focus of attention, okay? And that's the predominant wave in daydream. Lots of folks live there. Okay. Alpha, as I talked about, is a relaxed state. People who meditate frequently, part of the pleasure of that is, surfing those alpha waves where it just feels kind of nice to be relaxed, okay? Beta is an engaged cortex. When it's working on something, there will be flashes of beta. So, and then gamma is a high frequency wave that actually there's some very interesting things coming up with gamma in the treatment of Alzheimer's. And there's some really interesting stuff that is, if you're a rat, a good time to be a rat with Alzheimer's, okay, at the moment. There's been one human study that indicates that it may be good for us too, okay? But there's some very interesting studies coming out about gamma oscillations and training that, okay? It seems to clear up tau proteins and plaques, just activates the housekeeping area of the brain and clears those things out for rats. So it's a good time to be a rat with Alzheimer's. Hopefully, it turns out to translate well into the humans. But anyways, so we look at these frequencies, and there are some generalities. The brain can, for our talk, can be divided into 4 quadrants, okay? Basically, in the left front of your brain, you want the fastest activity, the beta activity. You want that to predominate, because in that area, there's language, and there's many things that go on left frontally. Alpha, you want in the right rear, okay? In the rear of the head is sensory processing. We're integrating all of the sensory information. We send that information forward to the prefrontal cortex. It decides what we're going to do about it and then sends out the signal and tells us what to do about it, okay? A lot of you have probably heard about left brain people, right brain people. It's not, it's a good way to talk about it, but there's really no, somebody who's solidly left brain or solidly right brain. But there are specializations. The left brain, left frontally, tends to be engaging, interested in the external world, okay? The right hemisphere tends to be more withdrawn and interior focused, all right? Left brain is cognitive and language-based, okay? Right brain is more the gestalt, the body, what's going on in the body. So left brain is text, right brain is context. The gestalt, all of it, and kind of integrates it. And what we look at is what are the arousal patterns in these areas of the brain. If I've got too much alpha up front, if I've got a slow or alpha or theta, a slower rhythm going on up front, all right, I'm going to be less interested in engaging in the world. I'm going to be more socially withdrawn, okay? If I have too much beta in the right rear of my head, I'm going to be anxious, okay? I'm going to be very elevated and anxious, okay? And so these are some of the things we look at. We get really geeked out when we use Brodmann areas because that's coming from slices of the brain and stains, and we won't go into all that. But there's a further mapping that's been established that pinpoints locations in the brain and specific activity of those areas of the brain. So we come to qEEG, Quantitative Electroencephalography, okay? So what we're talking about with quantitative EEG is we take this information, we put that cap, that funny looking cap on your head, and we record the electrical activity of your brain. We run that through a filter, which, in an amplifier, which amplifies it so we can do anything with it, and we run it through a computer program which quantifies it, gives it numerical value, okay? Once we have numerical value, we can do things with it, okay? Thankfully, I don't have to do that math. It does it for me, okay? So what you're looking at it produces maps. What's been done is lots of research has been done to develop databases of normal brain function, okay? What I would like better is asymptomatic brain function, folks who don't display problematic symptoms. And so they've developed large databases that are age and gender matched, okay? So a right-handed 67-year-old man, okay, they've got a database of what that brain without any symptoms that people complain about, okay? Put that cap on my head, record my activity, and then compare my brain to that database, and areas of where my brain is operating the way this asymptomatic normal sample operates are areas of green on these maps. If I have too much of a particular activity, it's red. So it's green to yellow to red in that spectrum. If I have too little, it's green to dark blue, okay? So all of these maps on the middle row here are just a graphic representation of the numbers, okay? And in this particular case, somebody over here has too much delta, okay? And little specks of when compared to age and gender matched peers. Okay, their brain shows too much of a particular thing. Where there's blue, there's too little. Okay. Down below is coherence. Again, red is too much, blue is too little. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay. So what we're looking at qEEG is once we've recorded it, quantified it, we then look at those numbers and we're looking at the absolute power, how much energy is in a particular frequency in a particular location. Okay? We look at relative power, which is how much energy in relationship to all the energy, all the electrical activity in this person's head. Okay? And then compare that to the database. Power ratios. How much theta? How much beta? How much alpha? We're looking at the balancing of that. Where is it? Oh, well, where is it is the next one, asymmetry. But first, just the ratios between those things, which we then compare to that normative database. Asymmetry, too much alpha up front, not enough in the back, okay, too much on the right, too much on the left, compared to asymptomatic people, and we give a graphical map of that, okay? And then coherence and phase, okay? Coherence is how linked, because we've identified hubs and network that do various things in the brain, and that research is ongoing, okay? But it's how well do those areas talk to each other, all right? Again, that's quantified in my brain and then compared to the database of an age and gender match. And then we get a reflection of that. And phase is the speed, okay? How long does it take to travel from the back of my head to the front of it? So that we'll talk about processing speed, okay? How well and how clearly I do that. And will give me indications of there's issues here, okay? So when somebody is doing qEEG neurofeedback, we've done the mapping, we've identified issues that we want to try and train. Yep?
Is the mapping done with just sitting idle?
So the mapping is done, someone sits in a chair, we put the cap on, and we record about 8 to 10 minutes of someone sitting in a chair with the eyes closed, doing nothing. And then 8 to 10 minutes with eyes open. Sometimes with some systems, there's also databases with a third under task, okay? And that will be a reading task and a math task, okay? And those databases aren't quite as well developed as they will be, okay? That's work that's still ongoing, okay? But there are some in existence now. I don't currently use those databases, but I'm watching them because I think that's an important thing to have too. But I'm not trusting of the norms yet, okay, of those databases. So once we've identified areas that are aberrant, that are not matched to symptomless peers, okay, we'll identify ways to train that, okay? And once we've set up a training protocol for that, someone will come into the office and we'll put the cap back on their head. And in real time, we'll monitor the brain's activity and in real time compare it to the database, okay? And it's what is called Z-score training. So if you've got, in statistics, you've got a bell curve, okay? And so you've got the 0 point where the vast majority of the population is, and then you have standard deviations of too little or too much. Okay, and so you can have too much or too little activity of the metric we're training, whether that's a absolute power, relative power, coherence, phase, whatever it is we're training. But we have a norm for it, and so if it's too much, any movement towards less of that is rewarded, okay? Any movement this way towards that is rewarded. So what the reward is, you come into my office, you sit in one of our booths, we put the cap on, we're monitoring your brain in real time, the computer's making that comparison to the database while you're sitting in the chair. You're watching a movie, a video, okay? So it kind of looks like this. As you can see, there's a cartoon. It's kind of hard to see, but it's a panda cartoon. So a child is sitting in the booth watching the thing. This is a graphical display of the map in real time, okay? There's a lightening and darkening of the video display based upon which direction you're moving on these thresholds, okay? So the equivalent to this is when you were learning to ride a bike, you had training wheels, most, okay? So the training wheel, because we've changed the rules of gravity on you now. You figured it out, okay, and now get on a bike and there's new rules for gravity, okay? And so you're sitting there and you go over this side and the left training wheel hits the ground. So you'll correct and the right training wheel hits the ground. And then you correct and then you correct and then now you know how to ride a bike, okay? That's what we're doing with your brain. We're just giving sensory information saying too much, yeah, right there. Okay? As someone is training, what I'm doing is I'm narrowing the thresholds. When they get good, I make it a little harder and a little harder, bringing it up to maintain that balance. And like riding a bicycle, once it's learned, it tends to be retained. Okay? So one of the things that will be in the materials is a link to a website, to a YouTube video called The Backwards Bicycle. Has nothing to do with neurofeedback and has everything to do with what I'm talking about, is how we learn, okay? And so there'll be a link there that you can follow up, but it's a wonderful little thing about how we learn, okay? So anyways, that's what it would look like in our offices when somebody's training. And why do we do this? Well, diagnostics, okay? These are 3 diagnoses from the DSM. All right, sensory processing disorder, ADHD, anxiety. There's a lot of overlap of symptoms there. All right, and the way the diagnosis is now, as a clinician, you take out a checklist, and I got 4 of column 3, 4 of column 2, we're gonna call it this, okay? But that also could be that, or it could be maybe that, because they share symptoms, okay? So it's not an exact science, this diagnostic and statistical menu, okay? It has had many revisions. When it started, it was Freudian-based, okay? It's evolved from that, okay? The language has changed and the ideas behind it have changed, okay? And that's not throwing out Freud. He had a lot of good ideas, but he also missed the mark on a lot of stuff too, okay? And so what we're interested in, when someone comes in with a diagnosis, somebody's diagnosing with ADHD, that's interesting. It gives me an idea of what might be going on, but it doesn't tell me a thing about this person sitting in the chair. All right, what we do is take a look at the brain. What's the brain doing? Okay, what type of ADHD does this person have? Okay. You familiar with Daniel Amen? He's on PBS a lot, okay? In one of his earlier talks, when he does something called SPEC scan, he does a little bit of neurofeedback, but that's not his focus. He has the biggest collection of SPEC scans, but he charges, he's a psychiatrist, charges his profession as being the only part of medicine that never looks at the organ it treats. It's always, diagnosis based on symptom and reporting, history and reporting, okay? Very seldom will they actually look at the brain and what the brain's doing, okay? So, we look at the brain. This is a classic ADHD brain, what everybody thinks about. Too much theta when compared to peers, okay? And this is a hyperactive kid. And this is a kid who's gonna respond really well to Ritalin, or any speed that you give him, and any of the speed, any of the amphetamines, he's gonna do really well. Now, he's taking amphetamines, but he's gonna do well, okay? And respond really well. When I was preparing for this, I was looking through cases and looking at it. I had a hard time finding this kid, okay? Because I don't see that a lot in my office. I get lots of kids coming in with an ADHD diagnosis, but I don't see this kid too often. Now, that's usually because the medicine's working, and that's why people come to me because the medicine isn't working, okay? I would like to change that because sometimes we might be helpful in helping your doctor decide what medicine, and saying, let's skip the trial. This kid's probably not going to do well with amphetamine-based treatment, all right, but might do better with other types of medication intervention. All right, but we can at least rule out a couple of those things without having to, here, take this and see what happens, okay? Just by looking at the brain first. So one of the things that I think qEEG offers is improved diagnosis. Okay, whether or not you decide to move on to treat it with neurofeedback or medication, both can be very helpful. Okay, neurofeedback is an investment in time, money, and sometimes the medicine works just fine. Okay, if you have the right medicine. All right. So I'm going to talk about a couple of different cases. Okay, this is about a 13-year-old named Johnny. Okay, he was brought to Gray Matters for an evaluation and neurofeedback due to a tendency to daydream and zone out. That's what's the presenting problems, okay? He had been previously diagnosed with ADHD and prescribed Adderall. However, the medication caused significant unwanted side effects, including nail biting, hair loss, and reportedly made Johnny feel like a zombie. Those are common complaints that we often hear about some of the medications. So they stopped the medication after 2 months. He's a very athletic kid, okay? He enjoys working out, ballet, tap dancing, playing the guitar. All right, and reported no issues, no social issues or anxiety. He was an engaged kid, but just would zone out. When we look at his map, looks pretty good. Okay, if we go to the colors, green is matching up, okay, with asymptomatic peers. Okay, yellow is heading into orange, is hitting into red. Okay, so there's some elevation in alpha frontally. But overall, it's a pretty normal brain map. There's not much going on here. All right, so the surface, that's the surface analysis. When we look at just from the surface, we don't see anything particularly grabbing here, okay? There's a mild increase in frontal power in alpha, which is a mild slowing. We'd like to see faster activity up front, but it not clinically significant. It was within 1 standard deviation, okay? But there was some slowing up front that might be related to that zone out, okay? Because alpha is as far as arousal, it's a less aroused area, and so it's less activated, there's less activity in that area. Beta is engaged in task. So if we had just been there, we'd be scratching our head, what's going on, okay? But we have other ways of analyzing things, okay? And that's the rest of his map, okay? We have something called SW Loretta, okay? Now what SW Loretta does is it takes that mathematical information, so we've quantified all of the electrical activity in the brain, and then there's some fancy math, okay? It's called the inverse solution. I'm not a mathematician. I went looking for it someday and I couldn't understand the explanation of it, and thankfully I don't have to, okay? But there are folks who do that, okay, kind of math, and they developed this program that would do it for us, okay? So I don't need to know how Windows works, okay? I used to know DOS, but I don't need to know that anymore, all right, because I don't need to, okay? So I use the program, and with the program in this inverse solution, we can pinpoint where in the brain specific activity is coming from, and we can image it based upon that. And so when we looked at his brain here, okay, we saw that alpha activity that was problematic, okay? But still, we're within, it's elevated, all right? If you look at the scale here, 1 to 2, he's still 1 standard deviation off the norm. So it's still, it may be producing some of this, but we're still not really sure. The other thing that this SW Loretta lets us begin to do is look at those connectivity, the phase and coherence, okay? And as research continues, that's kind of where the rubber meets the road, okay, is in those areas of the brain activity. This is stuff that is just being developed over the past 5 years, 8 years, somewhere around that. He's got, okay, so what we're looking at in alpha, or we're looking at coherence on your left, okay? He's got elevated hypercoherence, meaning in his brain, those brain areas, you can just, I don't know if you can barely make out the brain underneath all those colors, okay? So it's looking at a very dim brain and looking at the connections between areas of the brain, hubs in the brain. His brain is hyperconnected in alpha, meaning it's locked. Okay, it's locked in that, there's no differentiation of activity in all of those areas. They're all doing the same thing at the same time, which is not very efficient. Too much connectivity is a lack of specialization, and so the brain can do all the different things it needs to do. If it's all locked together, it's doing one thing, and there's more for it to do at that time than the one thing that it gets locked in, okay? So problems of hypercoherence, when compared to folks who don't have symptoms, we notice this brain is very highly locked in these networks, all right? And that in the alpha frequency range would be zoned out, okay? So here, the other surface maps and the traditional ways we would look at that, we don't see a problem. But when we get into coherence, we go, oh, here's where the problem is, okay? The second one is phase times in alpha. So although he's really locked, the processing speed as a result of that is very slow, okay? And so now we have some targets. What happens if we improve that, okay? And that's what his training focused on. So we got Fred, okay? Fred's 9.5. He came to Gray Matters for a qEEG evaluation in neurofeedback due to behavioral issues and difficulties with emotional regulation and attention. So he had trouble regulating his emotions and paying attention. He presented as an engaging, cooperative man, and though he was somewhat impulsive and lacked boundaries, he showed a willingness to follow direction and was exceptionally good at keeping still for the EEG recording, because that's always an issue. It's, can you keep still enough, or are we going to get all this head movement that we have to clean up before we can even look at it, okay? And we're dealing with ADHD kids and kids who have trouble sitting still. So we're doing lots of cleaning while we do that. But he was particularly good at doing that, okay, sitting there. On the other hand, Fred was also quick to touch things on desk and was eager to play video games on office computers, even the one that I was using, okay, at the time. Fred was brought by his grandfather, who described him as having difficulties controlling his temper, having no boundaries, and exhibiting little care and concern for others. In relation to the latter, he described himself as struggling socially. He had struggled socially. Fred's mother indicated that they had tried a number of medications for both ADHD and emotional regulation. Adderall, Focalin, Vyvanse, Dexedrine, Clonidine, these are all things that have been tried, okay? At the time of his assessment, he was taking 5 milligrams of Lexapro, okay, recently rescued from 10, it's dropped down, okay, and guanfacine, which is a blood pressure medication, okay, and so it's kind of trying to balance the effects of one with another type of medication to do with that. 1 milligram of that, okay? On the evening prior to the assessment, Fred's mom had called to express her concern with Fred's manic behavior. He apparently was particularly bad that evening. So with Fred, we see, again, not, overpowering stuff from the surface, okay? He's got deficits in delta, which probably is related to compensation, but overall, it's a pretty normal surface map. There's not significant power issues that would appear. I showed you that first one with this is what ADHD looks like, the traditional ADD. That was a surface map that was just glowing, saying too much theta, okay? up front. Okay, it's nothing's, I mean, there's stuff calling attention, but it's not grabbing me and saying, oh, this is really significant. Okay. The Loretta analysis, okay, again showed reduced power at 1 hertz, the delta, okay, and that was 2.5 standard deviations off. So that's something significant there. Depending on where it is, it can have different meaning. I think it's also probably compensatory to other issues, okay, and not truly the problem, but there's some heavy compensating going on, okay. When we get into the coherence, okay, we're looking at, again, a deficit. The blue is the deficit. So we've got a mixture here of issues, okay. It showed clear hypocoherence in the parietal lobes, okay, and the parietal lobes are primarily that's where we kind of distinguish between 2 points of view, okay? No, parietals are over here, okay? So it's part of the sensory integration. What allows me to do this, both with my eyes open and my eyes closed, okay, it's a knowledge of where I am in space. That kind of processing is there, my relationship to other things. And if I've got less connectivity in those things, that's going to impair my abilities in those kind of awarenesses, okay? If that is not working. If it's hyper, okay, it's not good. If it's hypo, if it's not, diminished. And it will have different manifestations, but either way, it's going to have an impact on optimal performance, okay? So that's where we begin to see that, and it's also related, the occipital lobes are also related to emotional regulation, okay? So we got a kid who has trouble regulating himself because that area of his brain is not doing things as efficiently as it could, okay? But we can now visualize that, all right? So I can go on with a few more. I actually didn't, not a clock, so I don't know where I am. There's a clock, okay. So what was up with Peter? Okay, so Peter was a preemie, okay, 3 months premature. He had a cleft palate and had multiple surgeries, and had 2 more to go, I think, to repair that. So he was previously diagnosed with developmental and behavioral delays. He repeated kindergarten. He's a twin. His twin went on, and he stayed, okay, to allow him to catch up behaviorally with his peers. Although very bright, Peter struggles with the ability to self-regulate himself, emotionally. He'll get surges and has trouble, get overwhelmed, and then will take him a long time to regroup and re-engage. Peter's school would like him to receive additional services under an ADHD diagnosis. Parents were resistant to this label because they didn't think it really described what was going on with him, okay? They wanted the services, but they didn't want him mislabeled, and so they came for a more accurate diagnosis, okay? Surface map, some significant things pop, okay, in that high beta, okay, towards the rear of the head, right? That's indicative of that emotionality, that anxiety. He's a high energy kid all the time, all right? So his, back when I got started, we would have seen a lot of these issues as problems of over-arousal, okay? So both relative and absolute power both point to a specific area surface where he's got way too much activity in the beta and high beta range, okay? And that would, correspond also with the ADHD diagnosis, but not the sleepy brain ADHD, okay? Because when I'm aroused, and that high level of arousal, that 3 a.m. footsteps arousal, okay? The blood flow is not to the cortex and the prefrontal cortex, it's down into the limbic system, which is where the emotional processing is going on. I've got way too much energy down there, okay? So the tools of the brain that I would use to learn and engage in paying attention aren't getting the same, it's not even getting the same blood flow. If we were looking at it from an fMRI, we could look at the glucose and where it's going, and it's not going to the cortex. It's going down into the limbic system. We've got significantly reduced alpha power in the rear of the head. This is with the Loretta analysis. This identifies the source of that high beta, okay, which is sitting right in the ventricular formation, geek alert, okay, which is about that threat response, that salience network, okay, and also connected to the default mode network, which is what the brain does at rest. When your brain is rest and not doing much in particular, there's an activation of the network called the default mode network, and that's just kind of a cruising, you know, that calm, alert focus, but you're not focused on anything specific. Sometimes it's referred to as open focus. You're taking it all in and not attending to anything, okay? It also is associated, you know, the default mode network is also associated with processing, attention, and memory. Memory formation, both short and long-term memory. All things that are pretty helpful in school. Okay, so this, I'll actually show you treatment, okay? That was his map at intake, the surface map. 20 sessions in, we've reduced that at high beta, okay? Relative, it's still an issue, but absolute power, we've definitely reduced, okay? The coherence measures are, we're moving stuff around, okay? That's what's going on there, okay? We still have some deficits and some problems there, okay? And we still got a lot of phase lag. And treatment end, which I think was about 40 sessions, 30 or 40 sessions. Again, there's been significant improvement in the high beta, okay? And now this is a case where people don't come to me to improve the colors on their map, okay? We stopped there because everybody was happy with how he was doing. He was happy, parents were happy, teachers were happy, and you know, we're at a good place, okay? And he's in his second time at kindergarten. How old was he? He was 6.5, almost 7, okay? There's some maturation. We know he's got some maturation delays, okay? He's a preemie, he's got, you know, he's not on the same time schedule as everybody else in just physical maturation, you know, but he's able to do some of the things that he wasn't able to do, and he can sit in the classroom and attend and re-regulate and all those kind of things. And so at that point, it's a good time to stop. Maturation's going to continue. We've improved things, and then, you know, if he has further problems, I'm sure we'll hear from him because they were happy with, you know, where he'd been at that point. So I'll talk about one more. Just because it talks about diagnosis and it talks about different kind of things. Sally was 27 and a half, okay? And she came to Gray Matters for an evaluation due to concerns regarding her memory. She was having trouble with her memory. She was diagnosed with ADHD by a local psychiatrist at the age of 7 and prescribed stimulants. And that was done off the checklist, symptom checklist, okay? And she took those stimulants until the age of 26. When she had received psychological testing as a sophomore in college, they concluded that she didn't have ADHD, but had dyslexia, and had gone undiagnosed because she happened to be really bright, okay? And then that was affirmed by a second test at the age of 26, okay? She's clearly high functioning, okay? She got through an undergraduate degree in a technical discipline, and then got a graduate degree. And she was working as a software engineer. High function, okay, dyslexic. Sally feels that she has issues with short-term memory and is concerned that long-term stimulant medication may have had an adverse effect on her cognitive function. So that's why she came. When we looked at her brain, okay, she had excess EEG power at 9 hertz in the left temporal and prefrontal lobes. Okay, those have to do with memory formation. Okay, it's the Wernicke area, it's language processing. Okay, this is where the dyslexia, both written and this is the area where that's going to show up. Okay. So here we have reduced power at 12 hertz, which is alpha, okay, in Broca's area of the brain. And hypercoherence in Wernicke and Broca, okay, and that's all language processing. So this is a mapping of that dyslexia. Neuropsych testing will identify dyslexia, okay? We can also identify it by mapping, okay? Sometimes we'll get people in, we'll do the map, they'll go for the neuropsych testing, and it will confirm what we saw, okay? But that's a reflection of that functioning. But this is somebody who's been on stimulant meds since the age of 7, without need, okay? Again, we'll all perform a little better with a little stimulants, okay? But it's not without its problems. So, how come we've never heard of this? Okay. Because we've heard of Ritalin. Okay. There's an awful lot of money to spend. Okay. When a pharmaceutical company comes up with a new medication, they have a very large market. They sell lots of pills to individual people. Okay. The folks that developed this field were developing software to sell to people like me that will then go out and work with people. All right. There's only so much money to be made there. Okay. There's some serious money to be made selling pills. Okay. Hope. On April 2nd, 2013, President Obama launched the BRAIN Initiative in the National Institutes of Health. Okay. And to, quote, accelerate the development and application of new technologies that will enable researchers to produce dynamic pictures of the brain that show how individual brain cells and complex neural circuits interact at the speed of thought. There's been money's back for this kind of research. That's why those last 2 things of published research have been exploding, okay, because some money's been allocated to take a look at this. As I said, there's interesting things in lots of areas going on right now. Okay, to me, just because of my age, I'm really interested in that stuff with Alzheimer's. It's really very interesting stuff. And the first human study with that showed it was with 45 patients in nursing care, all diagnosed with with Alzheimer's, who were given this specific training to entrain gamma activity in their brain. And what the 2 indicators that they were following was quality of sleep and activities of daily living, because that tends to deteriorate as the disease progresses. And the folks who were giving this training held their status in both areas. Okay, there was no further progression, where the control group had significant progression and deterioration in those 2 areas. Unfortunately, unlike rats, we can't take people and just now dissect their brains and see what change has happened. Okay, that has to come post-mortem. Okay, but there's some really interesting things coming there. So the money that's being put to this area, okay, we're going to have more and more treatments, and hopefully we're going to have more and more better diagnostics, okay, that are based upon brain function rather than just symptoms, because there are many different things that the brain can do to produce similar symptoms. That's about it. Okay. Questions?